So I'm going to just start by saying, again, thank you very much to Stephen for being with us here today to talk about language acquisition, amongst other things. And if I'm not wrong, we know this event has to do with what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. And Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you actually have some family connection with Ukraine. Is that right?
Yes, my father's side, the Krashen side, from a little town near Kiev, 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐻𝐼nka is the name of it. And they came to the United States around 1900, I think. And we used to have 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐻𝐼nka picnics. I remember that. Lots of fun, etc. So yeah, I have this this connection, of course. Okay, shall I start and say funny things? Okay, good. Here we go. I'd like to start by telling you a story. And really all I have to do is tell the story, because the story presents everything I really want to say today about language teaching, etc. So I'll give you the story, then I'll repeat it in a more boring way, because that's what scholars are supposed to do. I want to tell you what I've been doing at home during the pandemic. I have been in quarantine during the pandemic. My wife and I usually say my girlfriend and I, we've only been married for 55 years, so it's still fresh and exciting. And here's our life at home. Here's what I do. I've spent my time practicing the piano, not just playing the piano. I've been, as you can tell, I've been exercising a little bit, and I've been giving occasional webinars and also doing a lot of work. Every Friday morning, I go to the supermarket. The local supermarket has a special time starting at 6:30 in the morning for old people only, which is great, 65 and older, so that's when I go. The first time I went there, nearly 2 years ago, I got my groceries, got in line, and the employee taking care of my groceries, doing the cash register, I saw his name was Fidel. So of course I spoke to him in Spanish. Now my Spanish isn't that good. It's like language number 4, okay? But he answered me in English, which is what they're supposed to do. That's what they're told to do. So I was ready. I said in Spanish, I said, Fidel, tú puedes ayudarme, you can help me. Mi meta es hablar español como ustedes. I want to learn to speak Spanish the way you do. He liked that. I said, por favor, hablamos español, let's speak Spanish. So he was very happy to hear that. We spoke Spanish, and I've been speaking Spanish to Fidel just about every Friday for the last 2 years while getting my groceries set up in the cash register. And I'm getting better, no question. He's speaking much more quickly, using more idioms. In the beginning, it was just hablar, speaking. Now it's more charlar, having a real conversation, and we're starting to gossip more. Who was it who said, if you don't have something good to say about someone, come sit next to me? So that's what we've been doing. Actually, that was President Theodore Roosevelt's daughter who said that. So I'm getting better. His language is more complicated, etc. But I'm not getting better from talking to Fidel. I only talk to him less than a minute, once a week. That's not very much. I'm not studying Spanish. I'm not doing grammar exercises. I'm not getting my errors corrected. I'm not trying to talk more, etc. Here's what I'm doing. When I go home, I've been reading. I've been reading easy books in Spanish. They're called graded readers. I found a couple of authors who are really good. This is Adriana Ramirez, who writes, you know, these graded readers are becoming literature. That's the interesting thing. They're good. I've been reading her stuff. I've been reading books by 𝐕𝐵𝐴 Patton, a colleague of mine in the research, who grew up with Spanish, speaks Spanish very well. He's been doing graded readers. This is very, very interesting. I'm getting better from doing this reading, not from speaking, not from writing. And that's my talk this morning. It all comes from reading. It all comes from lots and lots of really interesting, comprehensible input. I'll tell you about one of Adriana Ramirez's books to show you how interesting it is and how talented these people are with limited vocabulary. One of her stories is about a high school student in the United States, a secondary student who goes to Bogota on vacation. And he's supposed to meet a friend of his at a different hotel, and he gets lost. He finds another young man on the street and says in his halting Spanish, "Can you help me? I'm trying to find blah, blah, blah." And the guy says, "Fine, and I'll take you there. We'll walk together." On the way, they meet two beautiful young ladies. The young ladies go up to his new friend, give this guy hugs, kisses on the cheek, etc., etc. They're very warm and loving and friendly. Then he introduces the narrator of the story, and the young girls go up and give him hugs and kisses too. Finally, they go on their way, and his new friend, his guide, says, "I suppose you're wondering what's going on here." Okay, these two girls are my cousins. Okay, there's nothing romantic happening. We're just, this is the way we are in Bogota. We're very friendly and warm. Don't think anything of it. In other words, what Adriana does in her books, she explains culture in the form of really interesting anecdotes that get you really interested and curious. In other words, what we call graded readers today are much better than they were in the past. They're really genuinely interesting. I'm now going to repeat the whole thing in a more boring way by telling you about the last 45 years of my life, which has been involved in building this theory and point of view. If you can look at the outline, I hope it's set up. I'll go through it with you. I'll run through the hypotheses that summarize the theory. It begins with the core hypothesis, the acquisition learning hypothesis, and this says we have two different ways of getting better in another language. You can learn language, you can acquire language, and they're very different. A synonym for acquisition is picking up a language. It happens, you don't know it's happening when it's happening. When you're finished acquiring a language, you're not always aware that anything has happened. You don't necessarily know the rules, usually you don't. You just have a feeling when something is right or something is wrong. It's stored in the brain subconsciously. We are very good at language acquisition. Our brain does acquisition very, very well. The other process is learning, conscious learning. Learning is conscious. When we talk about, I haven't had enough coffee, sorry. When we talk about rules, when we talk about grammar, we're typically talking about conscious learning, knowing about language. Error correction helps, or is supposed to help, conscious learning. You make a mistake, someone corrects you, you change your idea of what the rule is. So the 6-year-old child comes to English class and says to the teacher, "I comes to school every day." Teacher says, no, it's "I come to school every day." The child is supposed to think, oh yeah, that S doesn't go on the first person singular, it goes on the third person singular. That's what supposedly happens. Actually, it doesn't happen that way very often. In other words, learning is conscious knowledge. We are not very good at conscious learning. People like me think it's very interesting, linguists, but normal people don't. They're trying to communicate with the language. The brain does conscious learning very, very poorly. Next hypothesis, and this one kept me busy for about 10 years, kind of exciting, the natural order hypothesis. And this one says we acquire, not learn, but acquire the rules of language in a predictable order. Some come early, some come in the middle, some come later. For English as both a first and second language, the progressive tense comes early. John is playing the violin. The third person singular, I go, you go, he goes, that's late acquired. In first language, there might be a year between those two rules. For second language, as English teachers all know, the third person singular may never come. It could come a lot later. Let me state some interesting facts about the natural order hypothesis. Number one, and English teachers, you already know this, you can't change the natural order. You can drill the third person singular for hours and hours. But just like good wine, it won't be acquired, it won't be ready until its time has come. This explains a lot of the frustration we have in English classes, both the teachers and students. The order does not go from simple to complicated. A lot of things seem very complicated, like the progressive. That's a very difficult rule, but that comes early. The third person singular seems very simple. That one is late acquired. Knowing the rule is not going to help you, as you know, okay? I'll tell you a little story about this. When I was a linguistics professor, my colleague in the office next to mine was a good friend named Masayoshi Shibatani, and his specialty was Japanese syntax. And Matt Shibatani was the person I went to when I wanted to know something about linguistics, about some rule. He knew more about English than anybody I knew. So he knew all the rules. Matt Shibatani, nevertheless, sometimes made mistakes in conversation with the third person singular. His English was fabulous. His written English was absolutely beautiful, but he occasionally dropped the third person singular. He had known that rule since he was 10 years old, okay? Okay, the natural order hypothesis, the third interesting fact, was a big disappointment to me. It is not the syllabus. We don't teach the early acquired early, the late acquired late. It doesn't work that way. It's not the syllabus. The natural order is the result of language acquisition. I thought that was the syllabus. I gave a big paper on that, and I thought, here's the breakthrough. Not for the first time, not the last time. I was absolutely dead wrong about that one. The next hypothesis. We use consciously learned language for only one function. We use it as an editor or a monitor. Just before we're about to speak or write something, we think we're going to make a mistake. We inspect what we're going to write or say, and we make little changes thinking about our conscious knowledge of language. Now, people have accused me of being anti-grammar, of forbidding grammar teaching. Don't ever teach grammar. Teach grammar, go to jail. It's wrong. No, that's not my position. My position is a little bit softer. My position is it's very hard. It's very hard to see progress from teaching grammar. If you want to use grammar as an editor to correct your language, 3 conditions have to be met, and these conditions are very, very challenging. Number 1, you've got to know the rule. We don't know all the rules. The best linguists, the best language teachers don't know all the rules. Noam Chomsky doesn't know all the rules, okay? Noam Chomsky, I'm sure, knows more about English than anyone in the world. He spent years and years still doing it, analyzing English grammar, hoping to get just the right analysis. And in doing that, he knows a lot about grammar. He doesn't know all the rules, and he'll say that. He has said that. I had a conversation with Noam Chomsky. Can you imagine how exciting that was? And he says, we don't know the rules. The best linguists don't know all the rules. Number 2, if you want to apply grammar rules to your language, you've got to be thinking about correctness. We call this focus on form. This is very hard to do. It's very hard to think about grammar and correctness and say something and have a conversation. It's kind of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. It's tough to do. It's not very natural, okay? It takes time to do this. It takes time to drag up the rule from your memory, apply it, make the changes. What I used to do, and probably some of you did too, it's time for confessions, I would plan my sentence while the other person was talking. Big mistake, as I found out. You make the sentence ready, you get it ready, then you say it, you get it perfect, but you weren't listening and the conversation has moved into a different direction. So this can be rather embarrassing. You have a perfect sentence that is now completely off the topic. Okay, this is about grammar. How do we acquire language then? If we don't acquire language through grammar, how is it done? Let me illustrate this by giving you two very quick language lessons. And I'll use a language that some of you may know or have studied. And there'll be two quick lessons, and you can tell me which lesson you like better. Language lesson number 1. Wir werden jetzt anfangen, Deutsch zu lernen. Und ich möchte im Voraus sagen, dass nach meiner Meinung Deutsch ist eine sehr schöne Sprache. Und ich hoffe, dass Sie alle sehr viel Erfolg haben werden. What do you think? Good lesson so far? If I kept talking to you like that, do you think you would acquire German? No. How about if I made it slower? Would that help? Actually, that was pretty slow. That wasn't the problem. How about if I said it louder? How about if I wrote it on a board here, you copied it down? How about if I said it and you repeated it? None of those things work. None of those things mean anything. And you can see that now. Here's lesson number 2, and you have to watch me on the screen, okay? Das ist mein Kopf. Das ist mein Kopf. Verstehen Sie das? Kopf, ja? Und hier sind meine Ohren. Meine Ohren. Ich habe 2 Ohren. 1, 2. 2 Ohren. Und hier sind meine Augen. Ja, Augen. Ich habe 2 Augen. 1, 2. Verstehen Sie das? Augen? Ja, gut. Hier sind meine Brillen. Ja. Und hier sind meine Zigaretten. Meine Zigaretten. Ich habe keine Zigaretten. Zigaretten sind nicht gut. If you understood lesson number 2, not every word, but more or less, I did everything necessary to teach you German. I'm now going to share with you the most important idea I have learned about language acquisition. We acquire language when we understand it. That's it, folks. When we understand what people say to us or what we read, not how they say it, but what they say. The ability to speak language is the result of language acquisition, not the cause. This is a very serious cause-effect error we have made in our profession, okay? You can't teach speaking. You can only give people comprehensible input. The result is the ability to speak. This is the most important, I think, idea in the profession. It wasn't my idea. I got it from several other sources. I thought it was common knowledge, acquisition learning, but it turned out it's kind of a big secret. Not only does speaking not help you acquire language, it's also uncomfortable. I wrote a paper called Down with Forced Speech. Forced speech means making people talk before they're ready. So they have to speak using language they've learned, not language they've acquired, and it's very uncomfortable. I'll tell you when I discovered this. It was a little over 50 years ago. Yeah, gee, my daughter's now 53, so that's when it was. And she used to go down the street, take her down the street to a neighbor's house. Another little girl, her age, we were very good friends, we were very close to the family, and she would play with the neighbor's child. So my responsibility was to go over and pick up both girls one day, take them both to our house, while the mom went off to take her Spanish class at the local community college. So I went over to my neighbor's house and I said to the girls, well, let's go. We're all coming over to my house now. And the mom said, just a moment, just wait a moment. I have to take my pill. I have to take my medication. So she went into the kitchen, got water, took this pill. Now, again, we were very close family friends for many years, and I couldn't help it. I said, what was that pill all about? She said, that was Valium. Valium was an anxiety-reducing medication. Today, we would use a different medication called Prozac, okay? So she took the pill. She says, okay, I can go now. And again, I have to emphasize, we're pretty good family friends. I said, why do you need to take Prozac before you go to Spanish class? Spanish class. It makes me so nervous. No, I'm so upset. I said, what is it about Spanish class that makes you so nervous? having to speak, being called on in class. And the phrase she used then, I'll never forget, it freaks me out. Good expression. Wow. When I got home, I started looking at the research on this and what causes anxiety in beginning language classes. The number one cause of anxiety in beginning language class is speaking, having to speak before you're ready, before it comes comfortably. I also found some very interesting anthropological studies that came to the same conclusion. An anthropologist named Sorensen visited a group of people in the border between Colombia and Brazil. Only 10,000 people lived in this area. That's not a lot of people. If you go to, let's say, a football game and there are only 10,000 people in the stadium watching the game, that's actually kind of embarrassing, not very many people. In this group, 24 different languages. Perfect laboratory for an anthropologist. They had an interesting rule in this culture. You cannot marry someone who speaks your language, okay? My wife and I violated that. We both speak English, okay? So children in this group were acquiring languages their whole lives. Right away, they had to acquire mommy's language, daddy's language, the language of the small subgroup, larger and larger group, until they had more and more languages. They were acquiring languages their entire lives. Sorensen saw a big opportunity. He interviewed people and asked them how they did it. They all said the same thing. You don't speak the language right away. You relax, you listen to it until you start to understand it. That usually took about a year or more. They didn't force it. After a while, it took them nearly till adolescent, then they started to speak the languages that they've been listening. As he said in his paper, they do not practice speaking a language they don't know well yet. They may make an occasional attempt to speak, but if it doesn't come easily, they won't force it. It took them about a year or two until they were ready. Wow, this is exactly it. You know, we can do better, and we do better. I have found in studies of people who acquired languages naturally without instruction, kind of picking them up, it does take that long. It takes at least a year, 2 years. We do a lot better. We can do language acquisition much more quickly. We can get comprehensible input right away in places called language classes. When language classes work, which they do, you can get comprehensible input right away from a good teacher, etc. Let me talk a little more about comprehensible input and what its characteristics are. Number one, this is something we didn't know. The input has to be interesting. If it's not interesting, people won't pay attention. Every language class I had through adolescence and early life was boring. Same with you, okay, in those days. We discovered years later that it's a good idea to make the messages at least somewhat interesting. I think the best is a word called compelling. So interesting, you forget that it's in another language, and that's what's happening today in language classes. Language acquisition, it says on the handout, the outline is gradual. It doesn't come all at once. We assumed it was not gradual. Language teaching, when I was in school, you got the new vocabulary on Monday. You're expected to have mastered it by the end of the week, even after a few days, okay? Doesn't work that way. You get it a little bit at a time. Research from colleagues at the University of Illinois, I have a lot of respect for their research. It's wonderful. Their initial studies were in English as a first language. When you hear or read a new item, a new word, new grammar rule in context, and you understand even just some of it, you get a little piece of it. You acquire a little bit of the form and the meaning. After you hear it a few more times or read it gradually more and more till you build up the whole thing. So it takes 10, 15, 20 times until you have some idea of what is going on. What this means, big sentence coming up, we acquire language from context. We acquire language, we understand it thanks to context. Now, context has been attacked. People say, no, it can't be context because context, yeah, thanks, Sam, that you're right about TPR, exactly. That's the whole point. These things center on comprehension, which is a very good sign that it's correct. The context has been attacked because context doesn't always give you the right answer. It can lead you in the wrong direction. Popular example, the language acquirer sees someone pointing like this, and here's a word. Now, does the word mean finger? Does it mean hand? Does it mean like okay? Does it mean something else? You don't know, but the studies have shown that context rarely pushes you in totally wrong direction and gives you some idea of what the word means. Gradually, you fill in, you get the meaning. About 60% of the time, the hint that it gives you is right. It leads you in the correct direction. Less than 10% does it push you in the wrong direction, okay? So context is the way it happens. Otherwise, we would never acquire languages, I think. This has to be the only way that it really happens. You don't acquire language by someone telling you what a word means. You write it down, you practice it. The people in this audience, if you count your first language, second language, you know several 100,000 words. That's not like 100,000 trips to the dictionary, flashcards. You gradually pick it up from context. Let's go on to application. And I'd like to, again, tell you a story. I live about 40 kilometers from Los Angeles, a little bit out. To get there, I have to drive. I used to do it twice a week, and that was so I could see my nietos, my grandchildren. The addiction is still very strong, as some of you know. And they lived in Santa Monica in the city, so I would drive in. And I also had to go to Venice Beach and pump iron. And Arnold would show up. Is that cool or what? I actually had conversations with Arnold Schwarzenegger on Venice Beach several times. He would come, I have to say nice things about Arnold, very nice guy. You'd be doing your bench presses, as all of us do, right? Or your curls. And Arnold would come up to you and say, oh, that's good. Tie it like this, you know? He would always give us a little bit of help, a little bit of hints. And the people I worked out with, we would always share what Arnold told each of us because he always had interesting things to say. So we all got an advanced course in bodybuilding and weightlifting. He was like 22 at the time, already Mr. Universe. He really knew what he was doing. So Arnold was a super nice guy, and I'm happy to say that. Anyway, so I had to go there. Now, what do you do if you're driving 40 kilometers up and back twice a week, both ways? What do you do in the car? Well, you listen to the radio. That didn't work because all they had on the radio was the news. And the news was, even then, was about, you know who, Trump, et cetera. And I've had enough of that. So I started listening to music on the radio. Now, I have a background in music. It was my original undergraduate major. And I love classical music and all that stuff. You know what they did? They took the good music and they put it on pay-to-listen stations. So you had to subscribe. If you wanted to hear Chopin, wanted to hear Beethoven, the other great composers, if you wanted to hear the Bee Gees, the Beatles, you had to go to those stations. So I'm not going to pay. So I didn't. So I started stopping off at the local libraries on my way into the city. Santa Monica Library was my favorite because my daughter worked there and I could go say hi to her. And I started getting audiobooks, books on CDs, books on tape, etc. And I started listening to stories in the car. Now, the only thing they had in the local libraries, and still, is English stories, so I couldn't work on my languages. And I'm like college professor, big snob. I want to hear classics, no classics, only bestsellers. So best-selling novels was all you could get. So that's what I did. So for about 2 years, I listened to mystery novels, medical novels, John Grisham legal novels, romances, historical fiction, all this stuff. And guess what? They're pretty good. with few exceptions, most of them are excellent. That really made the ride into Santa Monica not so bad. They were pretty good. My first choice was, of course, Harry Potter. And if you listen to Harry Potter, you know that it was written for us. It's written for educators. J.K. Rowling, all the stories about Hogwarts and the classes, they're wonderful if you're a professional educator. The good teachers, the bad teachers, the good classes, the bad classes. One of them was the history of magic was taught by a ghost who was very boring and put everybody to sleep all the time. The good classes like defense against the dark arts, hands-on, fabulously, beautifully taught, etc. Potions, beautiful. The hero of some of the stories was Dumbledore, the headmaster. Isn't this beautiful? These books were written for us. The students, the stories are really about Harry Potter and his close friends Ron and Hermione and their adventures in all these classes. One of my students, I occasionally lectured on what went on in Harry Potter. One of my students got very interested and wrote a beautiful essay about Hermione. Hermione, one of the other students, always was in the front row with her hand raised and knew everything and 100% on the tests. His essay was, is Hermione smart? Is this what we want from our students? So I thought these were wonderful novels. They are so good, not just Harry Potter, but the other things I listened to, that I did what you did when you drive. When I got to my destination, I stayed in the car for a couple of minutes to hear the end of the chapter because I wanted to know what was going to happen next. That's how good these things are. I developed a deep respect for popular literature and for fiction. Fiction, stories, literature. And that became for me the basis for application. I'm not going to say you've got to use stories. No, you don't have to, but stories is a pretty good way of teaching language. I have a new term for you. The hypothesis I've been using is called the conduit hypothesis. By the way, a little professional advice. Would you like to be invited to give speeches all over the world, just like me? And people say you're very smart and all that stuff. It's great. The trick is invent new terminology and make sure the new terms are not quite comprehensible, so people think you're a lot smarter than they are. That's worked for me. Conduit hypothesis is what I call this. Nobody knows what I'm talking about. I've got to explain it. It's really quite simple. A conduit is a passageway, how you get from one place to another. So conduit hypothesis means we go through certain stages in language teaching. The first stage, and each stage leads to the next. The first stage is stories, telling stories. Language classes, more and more, beginning language classes are using stories more and more. TPR was mentioned by one of you, TPRS does that. Story listening, which I'll tell you about in a moment, does this. You build up competence listening to stories, and that prepares you for the next stage, which is reading, which is pleasure reading, as we'll see. Let me give you some details about stories. There's been a fair amount of research on stories in small children. No surprise, children love to hear stories. Your children did, my children did, my grandchildren do, they all do. Interviews, Gordon Wells study, you ask children, do you like to, when mommy and daddy read stories to you or tell stories? 80 to 90% say yes. The ones who don't like it are when the parents don't like telling stories. I think it's kind of strange because it's so much fun. Anyway, so this is a universal thing. Beginning language class, get this, becomes story time. Isn't that beautiful? Instead of going to class and suffering and learning these things and having to speak and making mistakes and correction, beginning ESL, beginning foreign language, is story time. I've been using the method developed by Benico Mason, and you'll see I use it when I'm in the car listening to stories. Her first stage is, she calls it story listening. She selects stories in advance. She developed this teaching English as a foreign language in Japan at a university there. She selected stories for the beginning and intermediate stages from Grimm's fairy tales, stories that she says have stood the test of time, that are interesting. She looks at the stories in advance, finds the words and expressions that really need to be part of the story that are a little hard to understand, and she prepares. I'm going to draw a picture for this one. I'm going to explain it this way, etc. Synonyms for that one, etc. The whole class is story time. Very often when we teach classes we've been in, you may hear, 10, 20 stories. Her students hear hundreds of stories over 2 semesters, maybe more. Stories that they find interesting, where they're focused on the story itself, because they're selected because they are interesting. Again, they have stood the test of time. The studies that Dr. Mason have done, I've co-authored a couple of them, show they do pick up new words, they do pick up new language, no question. In fact, she'll tell a story in class, and then like 2 weeks later, a surprise quiz on some of the words. They have acquired quite a few. They acquire more vocabulary than if they hear another story and write down the words and study them and do flashcards, etc. So the answer is never study the words. It's always tell another story. Tell another story. Well, sometimes we get worried, but if we just go on to the stories, how do we know they're going to get the right words? How do we know they're going to get the frequent vocabulary that they need for school? They'll get the frequent vocabulary because the words are frequent. The frequent words keep coming back automatically, not to worry. So we tell the students in these classes, don't worry about trying to remember the words. Enjoy the story. So language classes now are not only more effective, they're more interesting, they're more pleasant. Well, after a couple of semesters of hearing stories, doing story time, we start reading. This is called GSSR, Guided Self-Selected Reading. Again, Benico Mason's idea here, and it's what I have been doing in riding into the city and in the car. I've been listening to stories, and then when I go home, I've been reading stories, easy stories from graded readers, guided self-selected reading. Dr. Mason in her class, and I find this very inspiring, at the university in Japan, had access to a library of several thousand graded readers in English. Isn't that delicious? Isn't that wonderful? The first day of reading class, the students come to class, she spreads the graded readers out on the table. Now, these are kids who've heard English for several semesters, okay? And they look at them, they choose the ones they want to read. They try it out, they look at it, is this interesting? If it's not, they put it down. You don't have to finish every book you start. No test at the end. You don't have to write a summary of the book. No comprehension questions. If the book isn't interesting and exciting, put it down, find another one. The results, as we have seen, are very, very strong, okay? So we don't do vocabulary exercises, we tell another story. I've given you just a little bit of the evidence for this, that this really works. The goal, of course, is to bring students to the point where they're reading on their own, books they like, self-selected, and eventually reading authentic books, reading books written by native speakers for native speakers, and this takes a while. In my pleasure reading, most of my language competence comes from reading. In my own experiences, just so you can relate to yours, in German, for example, I don't need graded readers. I read original stuff. Same with French. I'm good enough for that. I read science fiction in these languages. It's so much fun. In Spanish, I'm now transitioning to the point where I can start to read what we call authentic books. It's more or less comprehensible. And that's the goal. When I reach that stage, when you reach that stage, you don't need school anymore. You're on your own. This is what we want. We want to make our students independent of us. So we start with graded readers and eventually move up to the other stuff. I want to give you some of the research on this, some of the fascinating research. The first study we did on this one I co-authored with Dr. Mason had to do with her method of guided self-selected reading. Some of the students in her language classes at the university in Japan wanted to see how well they were doing. Now, I want to take a test to see if my English has improved. We asked them to take alternate forms of the TOEIC examination. Now, the TOEIC exam, some of you know, is the best known exam in English as a foreign language throughout the world. The students took the listening comprehension and reading comprehension test. The scores on the TOEIC range from 0 to 1,000. If you reach 250, you're ready to start reading simplified texts. You reach 5, 6, 7, 800, you're way up there. You reach 7, 800, you're nearly up to the point where you can do authentic academic reading. So here's what we found looking at these students over the years. For every hour the students read, they gained 0.6 of a point on the TOEIC. Just reading, no study. That is really good, okay? Which means if you read like 2 hours a day of self-selected pleasure reading, books you decide you want to read, in a couple of years, 2 hours a day, an hour a day, you can go all the way from 250 to reading academic texts. You can go up to 700, 800 by having a good time, going to class, relaxing, reading these books at home or in class. Well, this isn't the only data we have. In fact, there's a lot of data. If you want to see lots and lots of it, I've devoted several years of my life to finding data like this. On the handout, there's a link to my book, The Power of Reading, and you're welcome to download it and share it with your friends. And there's study after study after study. Let me just tell you about a couple of them, just to give you a feeling what this is like. My former student, Fei Shin, was a collaborator on this study. This was a former ESL student who reached the point where, in the United States, where her English was pretty well established. She was now in regular classes, had graduated from English ESL classes in the United States. And at the school she was at, they had an interesting practice. When you came to school in the beginning of the year, in the fall, you took an English test. Then in the spring, before the summer break, you took another English class to see how much you have improved, okay? Here's what happened to this young lady. Her name was Sophia. Her English got worse during the year. She actually went down. Then over the summer, she was doing something, because when she took the test in the fall, she was higher than she was before. So her English was here in the fall. During the year, it went down. In the summer, after the summer was over, she took the test again. Her English was, she had not only regained what she lost, she got even better. What was she doing over the summer? You know the answer. She went to the local public library. She was reading books for pleasure, for fun, things that she thought was interesting. Sweet Valley High, Twilight, okay? Novels, you know, Nancy Drew, books that really pretty good. She averaged about 50 books on her own for pleasure over the year. And that's what got her score up, okay? That's what got her score up over the summer. Her mom was a local faculty member, co-author of our study, in fact. She said, you know, school isn't doing my daughter very much good. She'd be better off just staying home reading for pleasure. Kind of true in this case. Several other studies came to the same conclusion. Xian Li, another former student, became a dean of the university in Taiwan. She taught EFL there for a while. In her course, she did the statistics, did questionnaires. The amount of writing the students did on their own did not predict scores on a writing test. The amount of reading they did on their own absolutely did. Study after study has come up with the same thing. It's not how much study you do. It's not how much writing you do. It's how much self-selected pleasure reading you do, which is again and again the best predictor. Also, studies have shown that the best genre to use is stories, fiction. I'll give you a little history. In the history of libraries in the United States, the last century, there was a big movement down in the libraries against fiction. Librarians would brag, my collection has very few stories in it. It's all nonfiction, textbooks, history, etc. And that was a point to really brag about. The studies since then have shown, believe it or not, fiction reading is a better predictor than nonfiction. A lot of studies show this. One of the Sullivan and Brown I have listed, study done at University of London. A team of researchers studied the same group of students for years and years when they were children, teenagers, and adults. And they found the best predictor of vocabulary size was fiction reading, not nonfiction. Okay, middle-brow fiction reading was the best predictor. Again and again, this is shown to be the case. Fiction does a very, very good job. We'll come back to that, why fiction works so well. People complain, well, if they just read stories, they're not going to get serious language that they really need for school. They won't get academic language. The hero there is a guy named Jeff McQuillan, former student of mine from many years ago. Jeff reminds me of an exchange in Star Wars where one of the characters says, I was the master, you were the student, now you are the master and I am the student. This is pretty much what's happened to me and Jeff McQuillan. His work is so good. I've learned so much from it. 2 studies I want to share with you. Jeff analyzed the vocabulary in all 7 Harry Potter novels. He found there was enough academic vocabulary in these books to allow to predict the acquisition of several hundred academic words on approved lists of academic words that students should know. Be very hard to get these by direct instruction. They're all there in the Harry Potter novels. Another study that Dr. McQuillan did, he analyzed 22 novels directed at young people. Nancy Drew, Twilight. I'll never understand Twilight. I tried, oh well. Again, lots and lots of academic words you need for academic survival, etc., on the approved academic word list that appear frequent enough that it predicts acquisition. Okay, you need usually about 10 repetitions. The prediction is if you read for pleasure 30 minutes a day, you get nearly 40% of the academic vocabulary you need for school. My favorite study is Rolls and Rogers. This was done with native speakers, very interesting. They looked at 1 million words of reading in science fiction books. If you read 1 million words of science fiction, about a year's worth of pleasure reading, you get nearly all the vocabulary you need to understand all science. This really has affected me. Science fiction is my favorite genre. And I don't read a lot of hard science. I read it in our fields, in education, language acquisition, but I don't read scientific articles about biology, chemistry. But when I do, I find them surprisingly comprehensible. I think science fiction reading has helped a great deal. Okay, we're just getting moving now. It gets more and more exciting, folks. Stay calm if you can. What we have found so far, the more you read, the more grammar you get. We found this again and again. The better your grammar, the better your vocabulary, the better your spelling, the better your writing, and it comes from reading fiction. It gets better. Those who read more know more. They know about everything. Fabulous study done in 1993 by Keith Stanovich, his colleague Cunningham. Here's what they found. They tested college students, native speakers of English, on a wide variety of topics. You see the list: science, social studies, current events, personal finance, health, technology, cultural knowledge, multicultural literacy, to see how familiar they were with these areas. They then looked at various predictors. They looked at how much television they watch, not a good predictor. They looked at how they did on creative thinking tests, weak predictor. How good their math was, not okay, not a strong predictor. The best predictor, familiarity with popular literature, familiarity with popular authors, and to some extent, popular movies. That predicted their knowledge in all these areas. What was not a strong predictor was their grades in school. I'm going to emphasize this. How much, here's the implication, the amount of pleasure reading you do is a better predictor of general knowledge than how well you did in school. Not study, but reading for personal interest in all these different areas that you found interesting. This is a gigantic research result, in my opinion. I'm going to repeat it because I think it's so spectacular. The amount of popular literature you read, bestsellers, popular movie, tells you more about the world than study in school and getting good grades. That's where you learn about history. That's where you learn about science, etc. It's buried in novels and literature, okay? I have on the sheet, as you can see, the regression coefficients, if you like that. Well, it gets even better than that. I have recommended, by the way, that people should, this is a wonderful argument for libraries access, allow kids to read what they want to read. That's where you get this. Okay, readers gives you more, reading gives you more. Reading gives you not only knowledge of language, makes you a better writer, makes you more better speller, all those things, gives you all this knowledge of history, science, etc. It gives you better, what we call habits of mind, more desirable habits of mind. People who read more understand other people more. The more you read fiction, the more you have led other people's lives. You've looked into their minds to see how they're thinking, what their motivations are. That's what's in novels. The more you do that, the more empathy you develop, the more understanding. It develops a greater tolerance for vagueness. You don't need solid, clear answers to everything. A weakness of some politicians is this fondness for simple solutions to problems. And you know I'm going to talk about Donald Trump. I will not hesitate to talk about Donald Trump. It is my obligation. When Trump became president, we'll build a wall with Mexico and keep people out and keep things out. Didn't work. We're having trouble with China. We'll raise the tariff on stuff. Didn't work. Simple solutions don't work. It's a recognition that the world is complicated. By the way, I wrote a letter to the editor of the Washington Post criticizing Donald Trump. And they published it. It was wonderful. Trump is making all these simple claims. We've got to do this, that, and most of them were wrong. And it's because he's not a reader. It's basically that simple. I am following the advice of former American President Theodore Roosevelt over 100 years ago, who said it is the patriotic duty of the citizen to criticize the president when you think the president is in the wrong direction. So I've been following Roosevelt's advice. It is my obligation to point that out about Donald Trump. Well, there's not only the test scores, there's interviews. The Guardian interviewed a number of famous people and asked them about their reading. Fortunately, they interviewed Barack Obama and they asked him about how reading has affected him. Here's what he said. Now, I have to emphasize that President Obama had not read the same research that I just appealed to. He came on this conclusion on his own. When I think about how I understand my role as citizen, the most important stuff I've learned, I think I've learned from novels. It has to do with empathy. It has to do with being comfortable with the notion the world is complicated and full of grays, but there's still truth there to be found. It's possible to connect with someone even though they're very different from you. Noam Chomsky made this statement. He said, it is quite likely we're going to learn more about the human mind and who we are by reading novels than by reading scientific studies. So reading gives you all these things. Again, I never get tired of reviewing this. It gives you academic language, the language you need for success in school and profession. It gives you knowledge of the world, knowledge of history, science, psychology, all these things. And it gives you these desirable habits of mind, understanding of others, empathy, and tolerance for vagueness, a hesitation to jump to simple solutions. Now, none of this will work if people don't have access to books. So I like to put in a good word for the importance of access. I pointed out that Dr. Mason's students had access to lots and lots of books, several thousand graded readers in their library. And this is what the research says again and again. Here, our hero here in the United States is a man named 𝐒𝐿𝐫𝐚𝐬𝐡𝐞𝐧. 𝐒𝐿𝐫𝐚𝐬𝐡𝐞𝐬𝐡 has done several studies showing that public schools that have good school libraries and the services of a credentialed librarian, students read better in these schools. If they have librarians to help select books, connect students to the books, etc. Over and over again, this has been replicated. Good libraries are the key to all of this. Many students come from families that don't have enough money, they can't afford to buy books, and the way the economies are going now, this has become truer and truer of all of us. We're becoming more and more dependent on libraries, and libraries are becoming more and more important. I want to put in a good word for something I briefly mentioned, and that's the importance of self-selection, of not simply relying on assigned reading, but on books we decide to read. I want to begin with my experience because it's similar to your experience. I'm betting that the same thing happened to you. When I was in secondary school in the United States, we took English class, English literature. I remember one year we read classics in American literature. The next year we read classics in English literature, okay? I did the assigned reading. I took the examinations on the books. I read the books, I passed the examinations. I don't remember a single book that I read in secondary school English class, not one. And for mostly, I'm betting the same is true of you. But I remember all the books I read on my own that I selected. I remember the science fiction books. I remember all of Arthur C. Clarke's books, Robert Heinlein books, etc. And they were wonderful and had a huge impact on me. I also got interested, show you how individual this is. One of my favorite genres was reading books about baseball. I know very few of you speak baseball, but I'll tell you a little bit about it. A series of books about an American baseball team. The first book in the series was about a young high school student who graduated high school and immediately was a professional baseball player. 19 years old, played in the major leagues. He was fabulous. He was pitcher, threw the ball. He was so good that his first 17 games he won. Nobody could touch him. Then he fell in the shower, damaged his elbow. He could still throw, but he couldn't throw like a pitcher. He came back as a fielder, not pitching, and became a star doing something else on the team. A reviewer, this book has been reviewed in professional magazines, said, this is the book of Job for boys. It's that profound. I remember all these stories, and some of them affect me to this day. Wow. I'll tell you about one more. I can't resist. This is so interesting. In baseball, I'll tell you a little bit. The major thing in baseball is that you hit the ball and you run as fast as you can to what's called first base, the first station. And the idea is to get there before someone throws the ball to the person and makes you out. Well, usually if you're in professional leagues and you hit the ball and it's an ordinary hit, someone catches it, throws it to first base, you're going to be out because people don't drop them. They throw very accurately. But the manager of the team told the players, When you do that, run like hell. Run as fast as you can. The fielder might drop the ball. He might make a bad throw. The first baseman might not catch it. That's going to happen one time out of 100. But don't assume that the throw is going to be there. Assume there's going to be a mistake. If you don't do that, you lose. You lose getting on first base. You might lose the game. I discussed this with my doctor, as my personal family physician at a medical center, Dr. Pearl. I'll tell you about Dr. Pearl. And he liked those books too. He said, this is the way you do medicine. You get a patient who has very ordinary symptoms. You prescribe medication, but you better make sure you get it right. You better make sure it's the right medicine. You better make sure he's taking the right dose, that there are no side effects. 999 times out of 1,000, no problem. But that one time, there might be serious consequences. So he says, that's what this means. In other words, we have to be impeccable. We have to be perfect in our lives. I think about this example every day. This is what literature has taught me, okay? This is what you see even in baseball stories, even in novels for kids, etc. Being able to choose your own books is crucial. Donaldin Miller, a wonderful high school teacher and author. No single practice inspires my students to read as much as the opportunity to choose their own books does. Okay. When students see I value their reading choices, they begin to trust themselves to select their own reading material. So I have found this to be true as well for me. Some of the best evidence, I think, for self-selection, that we might want to emphasize this, is what happens when someone gives you a book as a present. We call this gift books. When I get a book as a present, I don't want to read it. I don't know about you. It's the last thing. And the embarrassing thing is, like, a week later, your friend says, how did you like that book I gave you? Wasn't it wonderful? And you haven't picked it up. Garrison Keillor talks about this, a critic. He says, as a former English major, I'm an easy target, a sitting duck for gift books. In the past few years, I've gotten Dickens, Thackeray, Smollett, et cetera, all of them great. None of them ever read by me. All of them now on my shelf, looking at me, making me feel guilty. This is true of all of us. What this means is self-selection. You choose it yourself. We all have exceptions to this. There is one person in the world, if he recommends a book, I drop everything and read it because he knows me better than I do, that I know myself, and that's my son. When he says, try this, Dad, I always do, and he's always right, okay? But in general, no, especially when it's fiction. We have to try it ourselves, all right? Okay, so I've come to my conclusion here. I want to ask and answer the first question. First question is, how do we get kids to read more? How do we get them to select their own books, etc.? I have two brilliant suggestions from librarians that I thought are wonderful. One of them was an article in the School Library Journal, and here's what the recommendation was. Give students permission to take books in the library that they thought were good and draw a star in the inside cover. That's it. Librarian agrees you can do that. Students go to the library, they find a book with 20 stars. They're going to be curious. This, I think, is brilliant. Another suggestion, another article in the School Library Journal, they put graphic novels, comic books in the school library for middle school students. They did not allow them to circulate. You had to go to the library to read the comic books, to read the graphic novels. Library traffic nearly doubled, people going in and out of the library. The amount of circulation of non-comic book material went up about 30%. In other words, make the good stuff obvious and easily available. Okay, let me open the floor for questions. And if you don't ask the ones I want to answer, I'll answer the ones I want to. How about that? So,
that sounds good, Stephen. Well, I've been making a note of all of the questions. There's dozens here. So let's start first of all with this one from a teacher called Sol Papandrea from here in Buenos Aires. What are your thoughts about reading aloud in class? Do you believe that learners benefit from listening to others read and reading aloud?
Yes, if it's a great story, yes, because it gets them interested in the book. That's the main reason. Hearing stories is fabulous. The research is solid, but it's got to be a wonderful story and a pretty good reader. The advantage is you're going to get more language and you might get interested in something you ordinarily wouldn't. I still like reading aloud to kids. We all do. It's wonderful. Thanks. Great question. Great questions are defined as those I want to answer. Good.
Good. Okay. Well, following on from comics, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this person's name right. Sule says that their personal experience with their son can help because they love reading comics. So comics, I remember once you mentioning Stan Lee in a talk of yours, the Spider-Man creator. Comics is something that you would recommend for second language learners?
That's the best possible question anybody could ask me. And now I get to show off and tell you how important I am, okay? Beyond anyone's conception. You are listening to the #1 expert researcher in the world, okay, on comic books. I am the #1 researcher of all time on comic book research because I'm the only one, okay? No one else is doing it. We published a couple of papers on the impact of comic book reading on research. And what we have found is, yes, no question, kids who read comics, better vocabulary, better everything, go on to read other things. It happened to me. I'll tell you the story that's happened to some of you. When I was in the 2nd grade, I was in the low reading group. My dad was a little concerned and brought home comic books and said, Stephen, I'll get all the comic books you want. I'll pay for them. Get as many as you like. I became a fanatic comic book reader. Soon I went up to the next level group, the next level group. The rest is history. Comic books do have some undesirable things in them here and there. Some of them are violent, etc. Some have too much exposure, okay? But that's not the fault of the genre. The genre itself is very, very good. Some of the best writing of all time. I got hooked on comics one night when I got insomnia, wandered into my son's room, who was a high school student, saw his Spider-Man collection, and I started reading them. I was there until dawn reading the comic books. They are wonderful. The big change happened with the Marvel comic book company when they introduced superheroes with problems, real problems. The most important one, of course, in the United States, Spider-Man, the most important person, I think, in American literature anywhere. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes and tell you my favorite Spider-Man story. This is from Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, I think somewhere around 1988. Spider-Man is doing his traveling through the city using his webs, and he hears the sound of an automobile crash. Goes in to investigate. A car has been hit by another car. The driver is badly injured, and he calls for help. Ambulance comes, goes down to see what's happened. Oh, he goes off and as Spider-Man, captured the guy who caused the accident, make sure he was taken off to the police, and etc. And the young lady in the car has been badly hurt. She's been taken to the hospital. She has injuries in both kidneys on both sides. She's going to need a transplant. He's already changed to Peter Parker, and he finds out that she has a twin brother. Not as good as a same gender, genetics, but pretty good. I'm going to find the brother and we'll find out if we can get a transplant immediately. Well, there's still time for her to live. He finds out where the brother lives, goes to the apartment building. He sees there's someone on the roof. Oh my goodness. Could that be the brother? He changes to Spider-Man, goes scampering up this roof, finds the young man. It is the twin brother about to jump. His name is Donnie. He knew his name was Donnie. He called out, said, Donnie. It was Donnie. He turned around. He says, Donnie, don't jump. Donnie turns around, sees it's Spider-Man. Says, Spider-Man, I'm going to jump and you can't stop me. I have problems I just can't solve. I've got to end this all. Then he says, besides, what do you know about problems? You're a superhero. You don't have problems. And Spider-Man says, great quote, you think because I'm a superhero, you think I don't have problems? You think life is easy behind this mask? And he thinks of his problems. He thinks of horrible things that has happened to him. He thinks of his uncle's death, and Peter blames himself for what happened, something he didn't do that he should have, okay? He thinks of his girlfriend always breaking up, misunderstanding, thinks of his horrible job where he's forced to write bad stories about Spider-Man in the newspaper. He says to Donnie, Donnie, life is problems. It's problems for all of us, all the time, every day, nonstop. True or not true? Of course it is. And we grow by trying to solve our problems, not by running away. Besides, he says, if you jump, you're killing your sister as well. He says, tells him the story. Donnie, of course, comes down. They go to the hospital. The operation is a success. Peter visits the brother and sister in recovery. And he's thinking as he's leaving the hospital, well, this one turned out okay. She's going to live. We got there on time. But Donnie's still depressed. And there's not much I can do about that. You can't solve everybody's problems. That's what's in comic books today. They're not all that good. I just chose the best ones. But that's what I would do. Yes, comic books. Yes, I would recommend comic books. Yes, they not only have sophisticated vocabulary, they will surprise you, but they lead to other reading as well. Thanks for picking out that question, Elser. Okay.
No, thank you. Andrea Navarro from here in Argentina has asked what you think about video games as teaching aids.
I really don't know. I'm not a player, and I don't know the research. And I hope people will do it. We'll look at it and do studies. Whether you get language, people claim you get literature, you get language. Do you get other things? Does it lead to more violence? Does it lead to more strategies? I really don't know the research. And what's too bad is that I have not seen an organized discussion of the research. I haven't found one. So if anyone comes up with one or wants to work in that area, I think it's a good area to work on.
Great, thank you. You were mentioning a couple of times graded readers, and Rima Buchok has asked if you've got any examples of graded readers that you might recommend.
Well, nearly all the companies have graded readers now in English, and I've seen a few in other languages. So I would just Google it, go to graded readers, the language you like, and you'll find companies eager to help you, okay? Good that you asked. Try them out yourself in a language that you're not very good at. For me, Spanish was perfect because I was kind of low, intermediate, that sort of thing. And they've really helped me move up to the next stage. I want to get to trying them out in Chinese. I actually co-authored a couple of them so I can read and understand a few in pinyin and also in the characters. So this is something that needs constant experimentation, and people like us are perfect to start it out because we're so interested in languages, and we'll read these things and we'll see the effect on us. Great. It's a good area for doing research, simple readers.
Fantastic. Okay, I've got another question here from Ludmila Futa, who's asked, do language teachers have to pay attention to perfect RP, received pronunciation?
Let's talk about pronunciation. I'll give you my crazy theory of pronunciation. In my opinion, we're very good at pronouncing other dialects. In fact, we're nearly perfect. There is no critical period for pronunciation, okay? We can all do it. We do it very, very well. I'll tell you the day I discovered this. I was teaching in Ethiopia. This was in the early 60s, teaching in secondary school. And I ran into a guy from the UK who told me his experiences studying French in high school. In secondary school, he hated French, he hated the curriculum, he hated the French language, he hated the class, they were boring, all grammar, had to speak before you're ready, etc. And he decided when he came to come to school, to the examination, he was going to take the oral exam in French in front of 4 native speakers, which I think is kind of torture for a teenage boy, okay? He decided to get even. He would humiliate the instructors. He came into the exam dressed in what he thought was French clothing with a beret, and he had a little cup with a red liquid, which he pretended was wine. And he started talking. First question, he started what he thought was a heavily exaggerated French accent. Ah, bonjour mes amis, je suis très content d'être ici avec vous. Hein? Comment ça va aujourd'hui? Hein? He thought they would be embarrassed and upset. They were thrilled. They said, oh, finally, you're speaking good French. Where were you before? How come you didn't talk like that before? Why didn't you do that in class? In other words, we have these accents right away. We don't use them because it's not us. We're not members of the group. Accent means club membership. You get the accent when you join the club of people who speak the language. We are very good at other accents. We can get native or near native. Good evidence for this is a conversation I heard, an interview with Peter Ustinov. If you know about Peter Ustinov, you know he's a magnificent actor. He's very good. And one of the things he does well is accents, and he speaks French. In French movies, I've seen him in French movies. His French, to my ear, sounds perfect. Native speakers say his French is really good, authentic. Peter Ustinov says, I can't do that when I'm speaking to French people in French. I have an accent because he's not a member of that club. Accent means club membership. I suggest we not worry about it. As we hear it, we'll get the best accent we can possibly get for our mood and how we feel about ourselves. Okay, like the accent I just showed you in French, I don't talk like that when I speak to French people, okay? Or if I meet someone from UK, I don't start speaking with a British accent, all right? I would be embarrassed, etc. And Alistair, don't start speaking American to me, you don't have to. But it does show us something about ourselves. So accent, in a sense, is not a problem.
Thank you. Well, Nina has asked a question following along those lines about the big debate between, what do you think, this is a question, what do you think about native versus non-native teachers?
Oh gosh, I've been involved in debates over this all over the world. I got in the newspapers in Hong Kong because of this. I defended, I said, my point of view was, it really doesn't matter. We would rather have a non-native speaker who knows what they're doing than a native speaker who's not a good teacher, of course. You don't get the accent of your teacher. You get the accent of your friends, of the club that you joined. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Get someone who's gonna talk about interesting things in class, who's gonna get you into really, really good books. I would like to just bury that issue once and for all.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to ask, how answerable this question is, I'm not sure, but Harry Karki has asked, could you give any explanations regarding the limitations in Krashen's theory to language acquisition, if there are any?
Let me talk about that. In fact, I can give you heavy criticism of the theory right now. I've been at this for about 50 years. Not very many people are using it. Not very many schools even know about comprehensible input or trying it out. When they do, they get success when they do it right, okay? That is things I approve of, okay? So it does work when done right, but it's not very popular. I get at home, we get the local catalog from the local community college, and they describe how they're teaching Spanish, Italian. You know, the first year we do grammar, vocabulary, then we do this, that, and the other. It's all very traditional. The theory has not done very well. And here's why. And these are things we can do something about. Nobody knows about it, number one. If you want to find out about comprehensible input and all this stuff, you've got to read about it or hear one of my rare presentations like this one, okay? The theory itself is buried in expensive and incomprehensible articles. When people talk about it, it's written by scholars who write in what can only be described as tortured prose. The articles are, first of all, not very comprehensible. Number two, they're too long and they're expensive. I can no longer afford to subscribe to journals. I don't know anyone who can. If you see a journal paper that I wrote an article in 1981 and you want a copy, you got to pay $50 to get a copy, okay? $50 US to get a copy of an article. The author doesn't get it, the journal gets it, okay? So what we've done to combat this, my articles now, number one, are short. If you go to my website, sdkrashen.com, you may download a number of articles for free. Please do it and share them. Also, a lot of my books are there, and please download them and share them. I don't make money on books. They're too expensive. Nobody can buy them. So what's the point? It's not, sorry, Sophie, I'm not very generous. It's either that or do nothing because, nobody can afford them. So number one, the articles I write are short. I try to make them comprehensible. And all my articles, here's today's magic word, are open access. They're published in journals that don't charge anything, okay? I published several articles in a journal called Language Issues, published by a couple of my buddies in Turkey. It's great, free. That's what I go to. That's what we have to do in the profession if we want anyone to find out about what we're doing. So I agree with publication, I agree in doing research, publishing, et cetera, but the journals have made it impossible. I am a professor emeritus at my university. I don't have library privileges. They won't Xerox articles for me for free. You have to be on the paid faculty to do that. That's common practice. So even for people like me, it's impossible to find these books. And if you do find them, it's impossible to afford them. But we can solve that talking to scholars, make your articles, at least some of them, open access, places where people can find them, make them short and comprehensible. Okay, next question.
Thank you. Okay, I've got one here from Hussein who has said, what should teachers do to make lessons more interesting for their learners?
Oh boy.
Big question.
Well, two things. Number one, tell stories. Number two, interesting reading. If I were teaching language now, I don't know if I could come up with interesting topics that would keep all students interested. I don't know the answer to that other than lots of stories, fiction, and lots of free reading. There's one, I think, elegant solution. We are struggling as a profession to find out what we should be talking about in classes. How about that? I don't have a clear answer. That's why I like stories and self-selected reading and access to easy books.
Speaking of what to read about in class, Nina Svorak has asked, what does Mr. Krashen, Dr. Krashen, think about reading daily news in class?
About reading what?
Daily news.
Yeah, I would make these things available. I would make videos available, audio tapes, all these things. If you want to do it in class, okay, but I would find it very hard to teach that way. But it's certainly a step in the right direction. No question. By the way, I get nervous when people call me Dr. Krashen.
Sorry.
Or Steve, because I'm not the real Dr. Krashen. The real Dr. Krashen is our son. He's a math professor, and I'm a pale reflection. So I feel kind of embarrassed taking his credit. Okay. Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay, there's a question here from Viapardo who's asked, if you think standardized exams the standardized exam the students have are taking some kind of effect on our teaching?
Yeah, the cure for that is do what we're doing. stories and lots of reading, and students will do fine on any examination. That's what the data says on exams. The TOEIC organization has done correlations of how well you do on TOEIC with how well people say they can perform daily tasks, like, order something at the grocery store, ask for directions. It does correlate with TOEIC scores. And the TOEIC scores correlate very highly with how much reading you've done. So no matter what, if you do a lot of reading, you'll be able to do well on any examination if you get lots of comprehensible input. Of course, if the class is focused on reciting complex rules, you won't do very well. But if you get comprehensible input in class, you'll do pretty well in any examination.
Thank you. There's some brilliant questions that have just appeared in the chat box now. I don't know which one to ask first, but a couple of people have mentioned children who may be on the dyslexia spectrum. If there's anything, like Olga, for example, if there's anything that you would recommend for children with dyslexia. She's asked if audiobooks might be a good idea, for example.
A quick answer is yes. More complicated answer, dyslexia has been a real jungle. There's dyslexia and there's dyslexia. A lot of dyslexia isn't. I'm not denying dyslexia exists, but some dyslexia is simply slower development and lack of exposure to print. Okay, and that's going to go away if we enrich the print environment, etc. True dyslexia also seems to do quite well with lots of comprehensible input. How do you like that? Does formal instruction work? We haven't tried the more obvious first. It's like we have cases of malnutrition. Let's first make sure we have a good diet, tasty food that's good for you. Instead, we leap to phonics. Okay, so let's talk about phonics for a moment. Phonics is now the rage. People are claiming the reason we have problems in general is a lack of phonics. Once they get phonics, everything is great. There's something now called the science of reading, which says that intensive phonics programs are the answer to everything. Newspapers are filled with short articles. A parent writes in, supposedly, I'm suspicious of these, say, my child was doing poorly in school. I got her a phonics tutor, and now she's reading Beowulf 2 weeks later or something like that. Amazing stories. I suspect all these things. I think they're written by the phonics industry. I have answered a lot of them. I write about 2 or 3 letters to the editor a day. These letters rarely get in. So I think what is happening now, and I will accuse people, that the phonics industry is responsible for a massive public relations campaign saying that phonics instruction is the answer to everything. Can't be, cannot be. We don't even know all the rules of phonics, first of all. And the ones we do know, after you get past the initial consonants, things like that, are too complex for anyone to remember. People acquire the rules of phonics. Let me give you an example. Let's say, I should have a board. Let's say I write the word C-O-M-B. Alistair, how is C-O-M-B pronounced?
I would pronounce it comb.
Comb. Good one. You've been studying your phonics, okay? What's the rule? Why is B silent? Well, I found about 10% of the people I've asked know the rule. If it comes after M and it's at the end of the word, then it's not pronounced. Swim, comb, etc. Most people don't know that, okay? I had to look it up. I looked it up in a book by Ken Goodman, okay? And that's the rule. But it's not silent after combination. Why not? Not at the end of words, okay? What about combing? Not at the end of the word, but it is silent. What's the rule? Turns out there's a rule for all this. I found out that about 5% of the people I know the rules for all these things. How could phonics be that important? What has happened to all of us, we have acquired the rule by reading. All of you have. It's from knowing the language and doing lots of reading. The phonics group assumes that everything must be consciously learned. My position on phonics, it's a good idea to teach a few of the major phonics rules, just a few, like That line and bubble at the beginning of the word is pronounced bu. Fine. That helps beginning readers to make text more comprehensible. Beyond the few simple rules, it's diminishing returns and pain for students. So a touch of phonics, okay, that's all right. Give you a little bit of a hint of sounds and words and all that. But beyond that, it's too complicated. Even the experts like Steve Krashen don't know all the rules. I had to look them up. So it's been really overplayed. We mostly acquire the rules of phonics by reading. My daughter works in a public library, and she says that looking at the books that are about to be returned, the phonics books are the most popular. Parents taking out phonics books thinking it's going to help their kids. Not true. Reading is the answer.
Thank you. I've got a great question here from Marie Pettigrew. Are there any firmly held beliefs from your past research that you debunk yourself now?
Oh my, I don't know. Well, I have changed my position on several things. In the beginning, I started out just like everybody else. I thought knowing the rules, that linguistics was the answer. When I was first starting out to become a language teacher, I thought, let's find out what the linguists know. Let's use their descriptions, make them the basis for lesson plans, make sure we correct all their students' mistakes. And gradually that disappeared as I did the research and examined my own experiences. So I don't think there's anything left over that I regret today.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask this question from Sarah Nabila, who said, is there a specific process or some procedures that a teacher can follow when reading stories or doing readings with students in the class?
Not that I know of. There's no substitute for an experienced teacher trying out different things and seeing if it works. My hunch is that the experienced teacher knows within a couple of minutes whether this is working with this group of students and knows alternatives. This is what we got to do. We've got to depend on the wisdom of real practitioners instead of academics like me who may have spent a year or two teaching and think they know everything. Okay.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask one more question here from Mario. What is your insight about having students evaluating the class by giving feedback about how they feel?
Wow. Really asking the students how they feel about the class? What? I think it's very important. And I think the question is phrased absolutely correct. Okay. How do you feel? How is this making you feel? Are you comfortable doing this? Because if that's not satisfied, we're lost. And I don't think this question has been asked. Are you happy here? Are you comfortable, etc.? Great question. Follow it up.
Thank you. Well, I suppose we should draw things to a close now. And oh, there's more and more questions coming though. I will ask this one though, from Shifani saying, where will this be published and will Stephen Krashen be doing more talks? Will you be doing more talks, Stephen?
Depends on whether I get invited. There's always, things have actually been on the decline a little bit with the economic problem. I've noticed that, and my hunch is that this will soon be over. And I love doing these. These are great. They can get around to more people this way, and they finally begin to understand what I've been talking about in all my poorly written articles. So I hope there'll be more.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question. As you know, one of the reasons we're doing this is for teachers in Ukraine at the moment, and we know that there are many going through some very difficult times right now, there and in many parts of the world, I am sure. And I wondered if you had any message for teachers who are experiencing difficulties and troubles out there at the moment, Stephen.
Oh my goodness. My only message, there are things I think we are doing that make classes more pleasant and easier to teach. That's the great part of this. By emphasizing stories in the beginning, not correcting students, having wonderful school libraries with lots of easy stuff. We're going to get better results. We're going to make life easier for everybody. That's going to take away the pain of the difficult time that we're going through. So that's about all I can say.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, one more time again to say thank you very much, Stephen Krashen, for being with us today. Like everyone's been saying in the chat, it's always an absolute pleasure to hear from you and your words of wisdom. So thank you, and very much hope that we'll see you again in the very near future. So I'm going to ask if everyone's happy with turning on their camera and just waving to Stephen to say thank you very much. That's fantastic. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, Stephen, to everyone else from around the world as well. The recording of this will be available on social media, and also the article that Stephen sent as well. I'll make sure that's available for everybody too.
I want to be upfront with the talks. I do charge for the talks, because otherwise I have to start eating outside, okay? You know, but I'm trying to get the absolute minimum that I can in order just to pay some of my bills, et cetera, and hope all these tough times will soon be over.
Thank you.
And the charge is minimal, okay?
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next time. See you very soon. Thank you again, Stephen Krashen. Thank you, 𝐒𝐭𝐞𝐬. We will all meet up together soon. Thank you, everybody.
Drink lots of coffee and stay away from junk food.
Always a good idea. And read lots. Thank you. All right, everyone.
All right.
Bye for now. Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.